Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Pankaj Sah, the director of the QBI, and welcome everyone to the 2019 Peter Goodenough Lecture. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Jagera and the Turrbal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and those emerging. And welcome Norman Swan, today's lecturer for the Goodenough Lecture. A special welcome to members of the UQ Senior Executives, some of whom are here, Clive Jackson and his wife Helen, Neil Matheson. Clive and Neil are members of the co-trustees of the Peter Goodenough bequest. QBI Advisory Board members, Sally Ann, and Mr. Bruce Humphries. I don't think Bruce is here yet. So donors and community members. Look, it's great to see everyone here. As usual, the Goodenough Lecture is one of the key lectures in our lecture series here, and it's great to see everyone here. So just take a moment to acknowledge Peter Goodenough, and after whom this annual lecture is named. Mr. Goodenough bequested quite a large sum of money to QBI towards motor neuron disease. This is a disease of which died off in 2004. So these funds were used to equip the Peter Goodenough and Wantox Research Laboratory here at QBI for all these years, and have also funded 2 scholarships from Papua New Guinea to attend at UQ. And Peter Goodenough spent quite a large part of his life in Papua New Guinea. And a biography of his life was written by Ron House, who was then communications manager at QBI and published in 2015. From pigs to penthouses, this is a biography of Peter Goodenough. So Peter was born in Cornwall in the UK in 1936, and he emigrated to Australia as a 10-pound pom in 1964. He landed in Sydney early in 1965 and pretty much caught a train and moved up to Queensland pretty much straight away, and ended up in Cairns, where he went on to develop a very large civil engineering company with extensive interest in Papua New Guinea. So by all accounts, he was a pretty difficult man and once described his 3 dogs as his best mates, and this is particularly through the Bougainville conflicts in the 1980s in Papua New Guinea. So Mr. Goodenough asked that these dogs be referenced in official naming of any labs that were named here. So Wantox is the name in Pidgin English given to friends, and hence we've got the Peter Goodenough and Wantox Research Laboratory. So he was diagnosed with MND in 2001, and he made his bequest in 2003 and pretty much died in around December 2004. So this was an inheritance. It was initially $3 million, and it grew to almost $11 million. It's now the biggest bequest at the time that the university had since the main bequest. And there's now a pretty strong cohort of researchers at QBI working in MND. And basically, this kind of research is largely supported by philanthropic donations by members of the community, and this research funds many programs at QBI. Members of the community are making powerful and lasting contributions to research in this community, and I'm looking forward to see what our speaker tonight has to say about this. So it gives me great pleasure now to introduce Norman Swan. Norman, as many of you have heard on the radio, I'm sure many of you are familiar with his voice. He was born in Scotland and trained in medicine at the University of Aberdeen and then later in pediatrics. He moved to Sydney in the early 1980s and joined the ABC pretty much soon after. He began the Health Report on the ABC Radio National in 1985, and he still hosts this weekly, and is the world's longest running health program in the English-speaking world. Norman has been an integral part of the ABC, where he has been very influential in the way the ABC is right now, recruiting many of the old-timers many of you might know on the ABC, people like Philip Adams and Geraldine Doob, and you may or may not like these people, but that goes to the culture of the ABC and makes it such a great place to listen to. So apart from the Health Report, Norman has made several episodes of Four Corners, the most recent being Out-of-Pocket Expenses in Healthcare. He was the medical host on Channel 10's Biggest Loser for 6 seasons and created, wrote, and narrated Invisible Enemies, a 4-part series on disease and civilization for Channel 4 UK, which was broadcast in 27 countries. I'm looking forward to Norman's debut as a serious actor on the stage, so I'm sure that'll be his next ventures coming up. So he has consulted with the World Health Organization and co-chaired a global meeting of health ministers in Bamako, West Africa, focused on evidence-based health priorities of health research. He has been the Australian correspondent for both the Journal of American Medical Association and the British Medical Journal. Norman is also the co-founder of Tonic Health Media, an integrated health television channel, and a production company which has over 15 million viewers every month. Norman has won many, many awards for his work, including Australia's top prizes for journalism, the Gold Walkie Award and the Michael Day Award. He was the third person to be awarded the prestigious medal of the Australian Academy of Science and was given an honorary MD by the University of Sydney on his 150th anniversary. Please join me welcoming Norman. Speaking today about serendipity.
Thanks, Pankaj. How did you know that that was my original intention in life was to be an actor? But I'm Jewish, and try telling a Jewish mother that her son, the doctor, was not going to be her son, the doctor, but her son, the actor, and it didn't last very long either. But it is actually one reason why I'm in the media, because it came, this sense that I wanted to do something else was there, and there's a much longer story than that. And one of my themes here is that, in fact, whilst this institution is devoted to research and discovery, and actually discovery in some of the most difficult areas of human physiology. On the other side, what happens in the healthcare system, there are some things where, without much more research, you could make a big difference. So I don't know, actually, about Brisbane, but I suspect it's similar in Brisbane to Melbourne and Sydney, is if you've got pancreatic cancer, so terrible five-year survival rate in pancreatic cancer, you can double your survival without another dollar of medical research. How would you double your survival? By your GP sending you to the right surgeon and the right unit that's experienced with pancreatic cancer. And with rectal cancer, you can triple your 5-year survival by getting sent to the right surgeon and the right unit. 60% of a surgeon's performance is the team in which he or she works. And what happens in that situation? Well, you think, well, if you go to a surgeon who only sees one person with pancreatic cancer a year, they're going to over-operate on them because that's why they're doing it. They love the operation. In fact, no, it's quite the opposite. When you go to see somebody who's experienced in pancreatic cancer, they do more operations because they're not so negative about pancreatic cancer, and they actually treat people more appropriately, and you get more appropriate intervention that's more likely to be curative. So one of the themes here, we're talking about serendipity, curiosity, and goal-driven. There is stuff you can do to apply the knowledge we already have. So this is not necessarily the responsibility of QBI, but it is of the system to actually pick it up and make a difference. And so, for example, with pancreatic cancer, why don't health departments tell you? Because some do have the data, not all do, but most do have the data, to tell you where you should go if you've got rectal cancer, where you should go if you've got pancreatic cancer. And certainly, you know, in Queensland, esophageal cancer has been a very controversial topic. And it's the one tumour where they kind of, you know, have got more of their act together, and Queensland was ahead of the curve on that. So it's a key thing to actually hold in your mind is that sometimes the research that's required is actually into how health services work and actually how you communicate and transmit information, because the information is often available. And I'll come back to that later, because data have a huge role to play in how we actually translate the results of medical research and put evidence into practice. Medical research is an honourable activity. The people in this room who are the researchers, they're all talented people. They've got minds that are huge. They are devoted to their task, which is to uncover knowledge. They all could be doing something else, and they would all be successes in whatever they applied their mind to. But thankfully for us who are not medical researchers in the room, is that they do what they do. And for those of you who are business people in the room, and business people think they work in very competitive environments, and they do, it is nothing compared to the competitive environment of medical research. It is cutthroat. Only the best ideas win. And even when you've got the best ideas, that the granting agencies have such low success rates. When I started off reporting on medical research in Australia, if you had a good idea, you could pretty much guarantee it would get funded. Might be in a bit of trouble along the line, but you pretty much guarantee it. That's not true today. You've got hundreds of researchers throughout Australia who've got great ideas, world-class ideas, and they're not getting funded. It's partly a side effect that we've had more money in medical research in recent years, over the last couple of decades, and you've got a bigger research community than we used to have, and it's more competitive, but the increase in funding has not kept match with the size of the research community. Now, one of the common stories that you hear, as an interviewer, when I do research stories, is I'll interview somebody and they'll say, and I'll say, well, where did this idea come from? He said, well, the person, you'll never guess. I got this idea, and I thought it was the only person who'd ever had this idea, and I looked in the literature, and would you believe it? In 1953, somebody had exactly the same idea. And they didn't do anything with it. As if, what a stupid parent. Not quite as that. It is a common story where it's sometimes, these days with molecular biology and the advance in knowledge, genuinely the information is new. But often ideas that are, I try never to use breakthrough, but that crack the egg in a sense to open up new avenues, often they've been had before in some sort of glimmer. But they've not gone anywhere. This is a huge problem in medical research. Because I'll bet I don't know anybody who's done a study of this, but I will guarantee that for a significant proportion of those stories of the person in 1962 or 73 or 1953 who had this idea and nothing happened to it, it's because their funding stopped. They had a great idea, they had a great team, it was all working, and then the funding stopped. Because the funding agency decided, well, we're not here for the long term. There are other people barking on, and you've gone slowly here. And they're impatient, and they move their funding. So you've got a team leader, you've got postdocs who've got their PhD, anything up to 10 years before. They've set their careers on this area. You've got PhD students coming through, and it stops. Then the team finds other work. So good people will find work. These days they're off to Singapore or China or the United States or Britain, where the funding proportionately is actually better, particularly in Southeast Asia. And the team is dispersed and they find something else to do. Discontinuity of research and ideas is one of the biggest problems, and I'll talk about some others in a minute, because the research community is not angelic always in this area, but discontinuity is huge. And our research funding agencies are not good at continuity. So there was the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne. They had a researcher called Don Metcalf, who made a major discovery that should have won a Nobel Prize and didn't before he died, called colony stimulating factor. He found a signaling compound that induced the bone marrow to produce white blood cells, and this has turned into a $10-20 billion drug actually, which was lost to Australia. Another story, but he discovered it. The Cancer Council Victoria funded Don Metcalf for his entire career, as far as I'm aware. So he had continuity of funding, that it was not disrupted. And they were not impatient. They said, you're good, we recognize you're onto something, we will continue funding. And they were loyal to Don Metcalf. And it took him decades to actually get where he got to, but he wouldn't have got there had it not been for the continuity of funding, which did not come from a government granting agency. It came from the philanthropy of Victorians, Victorians traditionally have been the most generous population in Australia in terms of philanthropy. They give a lot of money to the Good Friday appeal for children's research. So per capita, I haven't seen it more recently, Victorians are very generous. And it's one reason why Victoria has been such a leader in medical research, because philanthropy has been so strong. Brisbane has caught up to a great extent, but largely because of the boost in government funding for research in this thing. And New South Wales is still trying to catch up, which gives Queenslanders great joy to hear. And I speak to you as a Mexican. So one of my themes tonight is about philanthropy. So one very important role, and I think it's actually a more important role than young. So a lot of philanthropic organizations go for early career researchers, and it is very important early career researchers who need to get that leg up and move on and get established. But I think even more important than that is actually funding continuity, so that young researchers actually have labs in which they can work with, who've got a sense that it's actually going to go on if you start getting the results and you've got good ideas going. Doesn't mean that you fund bad ideas. Doesn't mean that you don't defund labs that are not performing. And that, coming back to the business people in the room, that's what happens. You get recruited, and within 5 years or so, you've actually got to be able to be generating your own income through grants to be able to survive. This is a tough world, but it gets good ideas out in the end. But 5 years, nothing magical about 5 years. You could just be starting to develop the good oil, and the funding dries up. Incredibly important role for philanthropy, because government isn't going to do it. Just not going to happen. And most people would say, if anything, it's actually getting worse. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So why have I got the word serendipity up there? Well, there's always been tension in the research world between what's called curiosity-driven research, which is, I've got an idea, I think I know what's going on here, and I want to actually explore that idea, versus, I'm going to find the cure for cancer. And often it is versus rather than as well as. Yet what drives the young researcher into the lab is this: they would love to be the person. There is no such thing, by the way, as the cure for cancer. There are treatments for particular cancers, but people are driven by getting better treatment and the thought that one day something they find in a lab will translate into the clinic and actually help people, make them live longer, and maybe, yes, even cure them. But a lot of the investment goes into the investigator coming up with an idea, pursuing that idea out of curiosity for its own sake. And then balanced against that is what you'd call goal-driven research, which would be, we're going to find the cure for cancer. That's the only thing we're going to do, and everything's directed towards that, which is what Nixon said in the early 70s, and it failed, by the way. But does that mean that goal-driven research is actually wrong or doesn't achieve anything? And if you're investing in research or you're thinking about donating to research, where do you go? Because cancer-based organizations will tell you, well, you give us money, we're going to find the cure for cancer. And those people who work in research know that they're not going to find the cure for cancer. But why not? And what is the balance of discovery? I mean, when you actually look at things that make it to the clinic, to make it to hospitals or general practice out there in terms of drugs, devices, and so on, what's the balance between curiosity-driven research getting you there versus goal-driven? And this is partly here is where serendipity comes in. You've heard the story of Alexander Fleming. He's about to throw out the Petri dish, and he sees that the growth of the bacteria has been inhibited by something that seems to have flown in the window. It's a bit apocryphal, but serendipitous. If he'd just thrown it out and put it in the sink to wash, penicillin would have been lost. Serendipity. And we love the idea of serendipity. The trouble is that historically, too much of what we've relied on has been serendipitous rather than deliberate in terms of finding it. two researchers, and it's now very old research, but it still stands because of what they did, called Comro and Dripps, wanted to actually see what the balance is of curiosity-driven versus goal-driven research. We were trying to achieve a particular end. And what they chose was open heart surgery. So if you take open heart surgery, what were the scientific achievements? What was the research that led to open heart surgery happening? How much of it was just accidental or serendipitous? How much of it was somewhere else that wasn't directed towards open heart surgery versus somebody who said, I'm going to actually crack open somebody's chest and operate on their heart? And how do I do this? How do I get a better pump? How do I do this and how do I do that? And if you think about open heart surgery, you go right back to basics. Electricity, mathematics, the flow of blood, physiology of blood. You know, Harvey would not have thought when he described the flow of the blood through the body that this might end up in open heart surgery one day. But equally, when you look particularly in Minneapolis, where a lot of the pioneering work, in New York, where a lot of pioneering work in open heart surgery happened, that's what they wanted to do. They actually wanted to achieve open heart surgery, and they adapted technology towards it. And the answer was that it's about 50-50. Maybe 40-60, curiosity versus directed. So you can't have one without the other. The question is, how do you marry the two so that it's not serendipitous? It's not accidental. It's not an Alexander Fleming moment. There will always be the Alexander Fleming moments, but we can't rely on that when we spend more than $1 billion a year, probably it is much more than $1 billion a year on medical research, even though it's not enough in Australia today, billions around the world. That's not enough to rely on serendipity. Now, the researchers in this room know that they don't rely on serendipity. But what we're talking about here is a hot topic in medical research, which is about what they call translation, which is about taking the results, say in labs at QBI, and applying it in the clinic. So you have people here in QBI who are investigating how the brain works, how nerves work, and they're doing it because they want to know how the brain works and how nerves work. Because unless you actually know that, you can't work out very much else in terms of the diseases of the brain and nervous system. But what turns on a lot of people in this room and a lot of people in this building is actually finding out more and more and more about how things actually work. Now, what happens in that process is discovery. Is things are found out. And sometimes those things that are found out don't necessarily connect with obvious, it's not necessarily obvious what they've found. So you've got people who know a lot about a very specific mechanism in the brain, for example, or if we're talking about an immunological institute, about how the immune system works, or how cancer cells work. But discoveries are being made here which will actually have an impact on cancer research. The discoveries that are being made here will have an impact on how the hormonal system works in the body. Because without the brain, the rest of the body doesn't work. So how do you actually deliberately make those connections so that discoveries, I'm taking QBI, but you could take Institute of Molecular Biology, you could take Walter Eliza Hall, you could take any institute and actually capitalize it for what you milk it for what you're getting there. Now, some people call this simplistically the valley of death. And the valley of death usually is much more simplistic, which is that the researcher is not a fool. Researchers aren't fools. They've got a new molecule or a new idea, and they know it could help somebody with dementia, or it could help somebody with motor neuron disease. And you're sitting there with something that's very tangible, you know, a potential new treatment. And across the valley are the patients with ALS, with motor neuron disease, or with dementia, or with Parkinson's disease, or with depression, or obsessive compulsive disorder. How do I get across that divide? So I remember, researchers get into this business because they want to help. That's the golden moment. From their curiosity, their ideas, they've actually uncovered something. And the problem in research around the world, but it's particularly a problem in Australia, is getting across that valley so that you can actually apply it in humans. And that is a very detailed process. So, for example, you might have a very promising molecule that works in the Petri dish and in a cell model. And you've got a couple of animal models that seems to work in there. But before you get to humans, you've got to spend money on what's called medicinal chemistry because it's not necessarily a clean molecule, and you've got to actually get it to a point where it's going to be the most effective. You need investment. Now, most of the investment I've been talking about that comes from grant-giving organizations is on this side of the valley. It's not to get across. And we in Australia, our financial community is really bad at investing in the Valley of Death. They want, and it's very different in the United States, very different in Israel, for example. What they want is their investment de-risked. They want to see you pretty much on the other side of the valley, and then they will give you money. Money at this side, when the risk is high, is very hard to get. And we're talking largely about venture capital. So there are venture capitalists who will actually put money in. There are risk takers. But the pool of capital, there is capital slushing around capital markets in Australia. There are people, high net worth individuals, institutions with large amounts of money. They don't know what to do with it, but they don't invest in this side of things. And that's another role for philanthropy, is actually to be able to take the results of research and move them along a bit down the pathway to implementation. Because it can take a long time, but it shouldn't take a long time. On last night's program, I had the story of Ebola, which is a terrifying hemorrhagic fever spread by bats, a virus. And in a remarkably short space of time, they've got 3 or 4 vaccine candidates, and they've got 2 drugs which seem to get 90% cure rates. So you can do it. You don't have, I'm always doing interviews with researchers, and I say, well, when are we going to see this in the clinic? And they say, 10 years from now, if ever. Because they know how long it takes. By the way, coming back to my very first point here about application of research we already know, it was known for 25 years that if you took low-dose aspirin after a heart attack, it reduced your chances of dying of a second heart attack by 20%. 25 years before that knowledge was applied. It took 30 years for the medical profession to accept the germ theory of disease, Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease, and Virchow's cellular theory of pathology. So, this is not just about venture capitalists. The Valley of Death, sometimes doctors are the worst enemy of the system here in terms of taking knowledge, trying it and testing it and moving forward with it. These are not easy problems to solve. But it does require what I call assertive philanthropy, which in a sense is what the Goodenough bequest is about, which is this is about ALS. This is about getting results in motor neuron disease. That's what we're funding, and that's what we're directing our effort towards, and that's what we want. It's not some unfocused donation. And in the United States, there's been a model of this assertive philanthropy, which I think is showing fruit in some areas. So the Cystic Fibrosis Association in the United States got fed up because they were doing things in the traditional way, which is they collected money and they called for grants from the general science community. And they got sick of it. They said, look, after 20 years of doing this, we've only had one new drug for cystic fibrosis and nothing for 20 years, and we've poured millions and millions of dollars into research. Why not? We're going to start having a much more serious conversation with you scientists, as parents of children with cystic fibrosis, about what you're doing and how we might actually get more focused investment here. And within a very short space of time, they had 4 new drugs in trials. And at least one of those drugs is now on the market, a very expensive drug. With another one, I think it's 1 or 2, I'll lose touch. Myeloma Foundation is trying to do the same thing, and so on, by just shifting focus. So the people from the community who are in the room here have a very important role, because the role is actually sitting beside the researchers and having a conversation about the work. In some institutes around the country, molecular biologists do ward rounds with the doctors, just to get a feel for what's happening on the ward. Doesn't necessarily change what they do, but it certainly changes their motivation and feeling connected with the work that they're doing. But so researchers sometimes resist this, that you have consumers, then it's a kind of token thing and a waste of time, and we just got to be nice to them and give them a cup of tea, and then we just get on with business as usual. But if you actually engage with that and have to translate difficult molecular biology to, we say, well, excuse me, just tell me exactly what you're doing, and forcing researchers to actually translate into words of one syllable, not dumbing it down, but just explaining what they're doing and where that might lead, often results in very different conversations. And that's what's happened in the United States. It doesn't replace what you're doing here, which is deep, important work on fundamental biology of the central nervous system. It doesn't replace that, but it makes a big difference to what happens next. And that also is the role for philanthropy, to actually get involved with that. One of the pioneers of this sort of assertive philanthropy is somebody who was in jail for conning people on junk bonds, Michael Milken, but also somebody who's not been in jail, John Kerry, the former Secretary of State of the United States, his wife, who's an heir to the Heinz fortune, she gets involved with this. And of course, the Gates Foundation is premised on very directed research. And what they're doing is taking researchers from institutions like this, who train really great researchers, who know a lot about their area, and pull them out and say, could you just apply it over here? Let's just change it. What have you got that might help with purifying water? What have you got that might elucidate Ebola? And you might get a cancer researcher who's actually got something to say about the treatment of Ebola, and vice versa. And you pull out people and they talk to each other, which of course is, you could say, well, there's a problem, there's an unusual thing. Pankaj and I were talking about this earlier. The QBI here is not next to a hospital, but it is on a campus with lots of other disciplines around. So when Jim Bishop was setting up the Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, he got me to chair a few meetings where he brought people in from the Parkville campus, from the campus of the University of Melbourne, who had never done any medical research, mathematicians, computer scientists, and so on, plus the researchers, and just bumping heads together. And at one point, we got into this conversation where an eminent cancer researcher said, oh, it's probably hopeless. I can't just get this data crunched, and we've got no money for software, and blah, blah, blah. And the guy from the professor of computer science said, excuse me a second, just tell me what that problem is again. And he said, blah, blah. He said, oh, I've got a solution to that. Come up to my office tomorrow, and I'll solve it for you in 15 minutes. And so the idea is that you actually utilize the fact that the University of Queensland is a great university with some fantastic centres in genomics, in maths, general science, and in the social sciences as well. Because remember what I said, it's all very well having, for example, you've got the cure for Ebola. What are you going to do about the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo? What are you going to do about the cultural fear that people have over doctors coming in, particularly foreign doctors coming in to treat them, and healthcare professionals that they murder because there are all sorts of fears about what's going on with Ebola? So you can have a cure for Ebola, but you actually haven't worked out what to do socially and politically, you're stuffed. And understanding that nexus is also really important, because we talk, and there's a lot of fads. So we're all into artificial intelligence these days, machine learning. And what's the possibility here? We're going to see radiologists done out of business and pathologists run a business, but to some extent that's probably true eventually. And machine learning can certainly help with crunching large data, but it's not there yet. But it does require a very different skill set from the skill set that's been traditionally in a medical research institute. And will be ways of crunching large data, and I'm sure there are people in this room already using machine learning. But there's also big data, which is another fad, but really has got much more potential. So when you've developed something in a mouse model in the lab here, well, who do you apply it to? Do you know enough about the population? And just like the story I told you with pancreatic cancer, we know a lot about the community. I know people get paranoid by this. It drives me nuts that people get paranoid about it because we hitch a ride on the Scandinavian data set. Scandinavians don't get upset the way we do about personal data. And as a result, we benefit from that. We know the causes of certain diseases. We know the patterns of disease in the community. We know a lot about what's effective in terms of treatments because the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and the Finns have done it using their large data sets. And we whinge about my health record. I mean, it drives me potty. If you've got a Woolworths card and you've got an NAB credit card and you buy a mango in Woolies, they know what magazines you read. There's a great video which I always forget to, but if you Google it, you'll be able to find it. It's set in a fair in Amsterdam, I think it is. And there's a guy, really good-looking guy with long dark hair, beard, olive skin, and white flowing robes. And he's saying, come in, let me tell your fortune. I don't know if you've seen this video. And so he gets people in, and they sit down, and he waves his hands around and thinks about, you've had 3 boyfriends in the last year. How come? And why did you move house? And starts telling people about their personal lives. And it goes on and on. People get really amazed by this incredible savant who knows through some magical way it does. And then about 20 minutes in, the curtain falls, and there's a bank of people on computers. And essentially what they've done is given their name and their address, and maybe one other data point, and they found out everything else about them from that. Do clinical trials fail? It's coming back to the Woolworths data, because people eat too much sliced bread. I mean, are there bizarre things that we do in our lives that actually influence? How many clinical trials fail because we don't know enough about people's lives? So we randomize people in clinical trials according to their age. We've got a history of heart disease, their education level, gender and so on. That's how we kind of randomize people to make sure they're just looking like the same. And then still clinical trials don't work. Well, there are some other variables. Are we using big enough data? Do we understand the population enough? Do we really understand the full population story of dementia? And are we harnessing big data? Now, sometimes grant-giving organizations will come up with things that will utilize that, and sometimes it will require clever philanthropy to actually back an idea and be prepared to fail and test these things out, where the frustration of researchers here is, I've got a great idea, I've got great discoveries, and not a lot seems to be happening. It's a huge challenge. The Gates Foundation with Warren Buffett, $5 billion a year into research in the most disadvantaged countries in the world, one of which includes the United States. In fact, one of the problems in the United States is that there's huge areas of disadvantage. And it's one reason why they're 17th or 18th on the life expectancy list compared to us, where we're up in number 2 or 3, depending on what year it is. So, and that's highly directed research. But the Gates Foundation is not necessarily interested in first world issues and problems from here. It requires local philanthropy to get it going. And what I'd say to people in the audience who are thinking of giving, and I hope that you do, is that you think about that balance. You can't have one without the other. You can't just go ahead and burst through and get the results and find the cure for cancer without the curiosity, investigator-driven research. But somebody's got to be there to catch the ball, take it, and run. And those first critical steps are really important. And it's up to the community, I think, to help fund them. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Norman, for that very, very insightful lecture. And I guess for many of the scientists in this room would welcome, well, not welcome news, but very pertinent news, really. And, you know, look, there's time for questions. Let me ask you, Norman, so what do you...
I hate this bit.
What do you do about influencing government and agencies like that? Because on the one hand, you know, community, I think, in many ways, is more open to discussion about these facts, and, you know, and listen, and, you know, listen may be the wrong word here, but at least to hear our pleas, if you like. Whereas people who are making the decisions about the larger funding bodies, NHMRC, ARC, and so, and MRFF, we talked about that, as to how do you influence policy in those areas which, in the end, will fund a large part of research that goes on in places like the QBI?
I think that some politicians still think that research funds like the NHMRC are just nice to have. I don't think they take it that seriously. And the Medical Research Futures Fund, for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, this is a fund set up by Abbott, and the idea was, initially it was going to be from the GP copay, which then died when Dutton was health minister, but they put aside money year by year to create eventually a foundation of about $20 billion. And then the idea here is that it goes into applications research. So this is the sort of research we're talking about, is how do you get across this divide and how do you apply new ideas in the clinic? It's turning into a bit of a pork barrel, and because in the end the minister's got to approve what it's spent on. The minister doesn't really have much power over what the NHMRC, the National Health Medical Research Council, funds, but does have a lot of power over the MRFF. So that is one of the issues in the problem. So one is, I think, let me just start at the research end. I'm not sure that we measure the outputs of medical research in a terrific way. And I've been part of this in Queensland. So, for example, Murdoch Children's Research Institute at the Royal Children's in Melbourne put into place a way of measuring research output. It's a long story, with key performance indicators. And there was almost warfare amongst researchers about this. And a new director came in, Kathy North, didn't like it and wanted to get rid of it. And the researchers told her, don't get rid of it. We actually now love it. Because the research output, either coincidentally or because of it, went up because of setting these KPIs, and scientists knew what they were aiming for, and it didn't interrupt the discovery process, but actually focused attention. And I don't think that we're as good as we could be in measuring the output. And it's not necessarily, one of the aspects is your papers in Nature Medicine and Science, and so on. But another aspect is, the output versus, PhD students, postdocs. There's all sorts of metrics that you can apply, which you already do. But there may well be others which actually then transparently show what you're getting, which is in value for money. And you don't have to convince the public, but you do have to convince politicians. And of course, the politicians, one of the reasons why they have, John Howard in particular, increased funding there, is that he knew the public wanted it. If you do surveys of the community, they would say, I would pay more taxes if I knew those taxes went into medical research. And so there's enormous power in the community to do this, but there's got to be a public discourse so that it's not random. There's still a bit too much randomness that's going on, and not enough collegiality, I think, between research houses, where because the money's so short, it gets very competitive in terms of raising money and jealousy. And then there's the whole thing about collaboration. So collaboration is really important. I described the story of the computer scientist versus and the cancer researcher, and that's collaboration. But the NHMRC had this great idea that we were going to fund collaboration. Well, what for? To collaborate requires a lot of time and energy and money to actually do it if it doesn't actually mean anything and it's just for the sake of collaboration. But how do you get meaningful collaborations, and how do you know who you should collaborate with to actually get the most result? Because it may not be the people that you are collaborating with now. And so I think the community has got a huge responsibility here to communicate with their politicians when they can, and people like us in the media to be able to communicate to the public. And what's happened in the ABC is that we've gone from a unit of about 5 people to 25 people. We've now got the largest science unit in the world, broadcast science unit. And we've got young kids who are really bright with PhDs, working in Brisbane, working in Melbourne, working in Sydney. And I've got a producer that I don't walk across the road with him because he'll push me under a bus because he wants my job. And it's fantastic, really bright people, and who are devoted to actually churning that out. When major newspapers, major media have shrunk and don't have, Fairfax, if you combine the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, had a huge science unit at one point, bigger than us. And now it's 1 or 2 people.
Thanks, Norman.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed that immensely. I just wanted to follow on from Khadijah's question. Khadijah was saying, well, how do we persuade government to provide more funding for research? But I would take it to the next step and say, how do we persuade people that it's something worth casting a vote in favour of? And I would argue that we haven't quite got there yet, that it's easy for health research where there's a direct health outcome. So if you're a cancer researcher as one example, but if you do basic research, curiosity-driven research where there's not a clear end goal in terms of a health outcome, how do we persuade people generally that it's worth investing in and it's worth backing governments that will fund that kind of work?
I think you need. So I honestly do not think that the general public need too much convincing of this. I think it's intuitively people kind of know it, that you've got to have people working in labs or what have you to actually generate the ideas that's going to result in that. So people understand that. For some reason, so politicians are often people there are very few people in Parliament with any science background. So there used to be a few doctors in Parliament. I don't know if there are any anymore, but very few people with a science training. So they're lawyers, farmers, business people, and so on. Very few people who understand science. And it comes back to being able to demonstrate benefits clearly with stories. And so there's a clear pathway in a story and understanding what the problem is. And there are no easy answers. So Turnbull understood this, and he developed some structures to be able to do it, but didn't unfortunately have the political power. Well, he didn't have the political strength to actually follow it through. So, and if he had that, actually it would have been transformative. But, Barry Jones used to be laughed at in the Labour cabinet. They used to laugh at Barry. And I'm not sure that Kim Carr has got much more traction there. This is a real problem, and therefore it's just hard work. It's walking the corridors of Parliament. It's walking the corridors of Parliament with voters. It's not all scientists. It's people from the community, and talking to them. So if you're talking to the National Party, you walk in with some people from the agricultural community, not just you, so that they know that there could be votes in this. And it's not as if this doesn't happen, it does, but I just don't think you can let up. And it has worked to some extent. I mean, NHMRC has gone up to a lot over the it's just not gone up enough.
Norman, have you got any pearls of wisdom for those of us who work in science communication, who are trying to communicate these difficult concepts that scientists need to communicate?
So do I have pearls of wisdom? I've been doing this for a long time, and there's always a way to tell a story. And but sometimes it's really hard. And so I got on very well with Gus Nossel, who's director of the Walter and Eliza Hall. And Gus used to get very frustrated that I wouldn't do a story on his groundbreaking work on the T cell with Shaq Miller and others, because I just find it so difficult. But I was wrong. There are always ways to tell a story, and you've just got to find it. And sometimes it's with a human face, but the trouble is not everything has a human face. And you just got to be able to dig down and find where the story is. And sometimes it's hard. But I think that what we often do is underestimate the public's capacity to understand. I think the public has enormous capacity to understand, and you don't need to have been to university to do it. And as long as the jargon is minimized, I think people will come with you on very difficult concepts and go along that journey because they're curious. People did buy millions of copies of A Brief History of Time, although it is said to be the most unread book ever. But people were prepared to tackle something that was really hard, and what's harder than cosmology. But this captured the idea of the beginning of time and black holes and that sort of concept. And there's always a way of doing it. And neuroscience, people are absolutely fascinated by. Clive.
Just because it's very topical, being involved with the...
Just so they're recording.
Yeah, just with our current project to find a cure for motor neuron disease, is you just mentioned about people or scientists explaining what they're doing. And I think one of the problems is that perhaps a lot of scientists don't think that the general population will understand what they're doing. And so I think I would like to see, and because I've managed to get a bit of an understanding about what we're doing in our project, is you would target a lot of people to help fund a project if you said, now we're taking a molecule and we're doing this, this and that, and we've actually achieved this. And to get, you can explain things in layman's terms. And if someone understands what you're doing and where you're going, I think you're far more likely to get funding for that because they can see it, rather than say, we're working on a project to cure this. And I think this is a bit what you're saying.
Come on the journey with us.
Yeah, and this is talking about the communication, is get in there and talk and get it so that a member of the public can understand it. And I think that's where we should target for particularly the community. Government is more likely to fund general research, but if you're wanting money from the community, tell them exactly what you're doing. Take them in that little, on that journey and where you are and where you see you're going. And I think that would help a great deal.
I agree.